We're doing Morphy's opera game today. If you haven't heard of Paul Morphy, he's a very, very talented 19th century American chess player. He's a really, really strong player. And there's quite a funny story behind this game. Essentially, number one, Morphy was playing two opponents. He was playing the Carl II, the Duke of Brunswick, and Count Isuard. And not only was he doing that, he was playing them at the opera. So if you thought, the opera, how can you make that more fun? Well, chess. There you go. Add the chess game. And even more on top of that, Morphy was playing with his back to the opera because the other two wanted to watch it. So he had to keep looking over his shoulder if he wanted to catch the opera in the middle of the vastly more important chess game. So the idea today is that I'll go over this game. It's quite a short game, and afterwards, if people are around, they seemed pretty up for it on Sunday. I'll play a few challenges on live chess for anyone who wants a game. So, without further ado, let's dive into the game. So, Paul Morphy playing the white pieces. We'll get to that quote in a minute. And the Duke of Brunswick and the Count playing the black pieces. So, e4, e5, even back then, pretty standard stuff. Game was played sometime in the 19th century. Knight f3 and d6. This is called Philadel's defense. It's a bit weak, it's a bit passive. Blocks your bishop in before you've got it out. Better is probably just to progress with bringing the knight out, then develop the bishop, then close the pawn chain with your bishop outside it. But just a bit of background on the two players. That Carl, the Duke of Brunswick, and the Count, they were like strong players, but they were amateurs. They were strong amateurs. So they knew a bit of chess, but they weren't like the best. So we'll see. We'll see if they can hold their own. There are two of them after all. So d6 and d4, just attacking the center. That's what you want to do in these positions if your opponent's being a bit passive. And bishop g5, and already we've got our good friend Bobby Fischer coming back in. We can't go a week without talking about him. He had one word to say about this move. He said weak. It's a weak move. We go on about players playing like book moves in the opening, and funnily enough, this was a book move in the opening back in those days. It's just the books weren't very good. So this is what was accepted theory, but as Bobby Fischer points out, it's a bit weak. So let's see why is it weak. Paul Morphy continues with d takes on e5, and already you've got to be careful because you might jump straight into capturing back with the pawn because it's the only piece that can capture back. If you do that, you run into this problem. Number one, white can swap the queens off, and now you can't castle. And number two, given your queen's now gone from the defense of this pawn, the knight comes in to take it. So you lose a pawn and you lose your right to castle. So not something you want to do on move 4. So instead, you remove the defender of the pawn first, or rather, what will be the attacker of your pawn when you recapture with bishop takes here. So bishop takes the knight. The queen recaptures because you don't really want to double your pawns when you can capture the queen, even though you are bringing your queen out a little bit early, but that's not a problem. And now we're recapturing the pawn. So, not too bad. But the problem is that white has a bit more activity here. Black's completely not developed any pieces. White's got his queen out. These bishops are primed to come out. And white's only 1 move, 2 moves away from castling. Anyway, let's see how it goes. So, bishop c4. I mean, seems like a pretty good move. I mean, if people know Scholar's Mate, this is basically, in effect, Scholar's Mate. You bring your queen here or here. You bring the white bishop out here, and you attack. excuse me, this weak f7 square, which is only defended by the king. If black just plays a slow move like pushing a pawn, queen captures here, checkmate, you lose. So you've got to stop checkmate. The move played in the game was knight f6. Looks like a pretty natural move. I'm always going on about getting your minor pieces out. It blocks the threat of checkmate, puts pressure on this pawn. Unfortunately, it's not the most precise move. And if anyone in the chat wants to hazard a guess as to what Paul Morphy played here to exploit the impreciseness of this move, then feel free. I am keeping an eye on the chat this week. So things to consider are the fact that there are a few pieces which are quite weak in this position. This pawn's undefended. This pawn's undefended. This pawn is defended, but you're attacking it once, so it's like sort of undefended. So Morphy's gonna make a move here to exploit those weaknesses, and it's the reason why knight f6 isn't a great move. So we haven't had any candidate answers in the chat, so I'll tell you the answer. Queen b3, and why is queen b3 a good move? Well, now we've got two attackers on this pawn. If black were to allow us to take it, it will come with check. The king can't recapture because the queen x-rays through and defends the bishop. So you'll have to move your king, and then you're already in a horrible position. King's stuck in the middle of the board. You're not going to be able to castle. You don't want to allow that. Problem is, if you defend this pawn is hanging. So the queen just comes in and takes the pawn with a threat on the rook. So a better move than knight f6 would just be to. I mean, again, it looks a bit weird playing a queen move this early, but queen d7. So queen d7 preemptively defends this pawn, and now if the queen comes here, you can push this pawn or something to defend it. But it's you can defend just the one threat rather than two. So that wasn't the move that was played. So knight f6, queen b3, and this is the best move, queen e7. So as I mentioned, you don't want to allow this capture to come with check. You can weather losing a pawn. Maybe not against Morphy, but you can allow it. Interestingly, in this position, after queen e7, Morphy doesn't elect to capture the pawn because your poor Morphy, he wants fireworks. Like, he wants a really exciting game. He doesn't want to just go into an end game where he's a pawn up and just grind it out. So I'll show you what happens if you might think, oh well, doesn't capturing the pawn just win the rook? Unfortunately not, because of one resource that black has, which is this queen b4 check. And now the queen attacks the white queen and the white king. So, well, if you don't want to lose your queen, you have to take your opponent's queen. The bishop comes out to block, and then you're blocked with the pawn or the knight. But you go into this sort of mid-game position, a pawn up, and it would be a fine game. Morphy would probably win, but it's not what he wants to go for. He wants to keep the queens on the board. He wants fireworks. So instead, bring another piece out with knight c3. c6, just trying to wrest control over these squares. You don't really want, if this bishop develops here to pin your knight, you don't want this knight to come here with an attack on the queen and the knight. It just takes the squares away from white's pieces. And as I was saying, bishop g5, pinning the knight. So now if the knight moves, oh dear, that's not the move that was played. If the knight moves, the queen will be captured. And it's a bit of a shame. Like, you can see how bad this knight f6 move was now, because he had to respond to it with queen e7, which wasn't really a great move anyway, because now the bishop's blocked in, the knight is pinned, your queen's looking a bit weird on that square, and this knight can't come to here because you've pushed the pawn. So, and actually Bobby Fischer made a comment on this game when he was looking at it, obviously not at the time because he was yet to be born when it was played, but he just mentioned that black is in a bit of a Zugswang position, which is, if you're not familiar with that word, it's basically a German word which means he doesn't have a good move. So he tries b5, and it might look like a pretty natural move, that, because bishop can't go here because it take by the pawn, it can't go here, it can't take this, otherwise you'll just lose material. So you force the bishop back, relieve a bit of pressure, continue developing your pieces, should have a fine game. The problem is this falls to a rather nice tactic, and it's why this game is used in a lot of teaching scenarios, because we've already seen the importance of developing your pieces. So the Count and the Duke have yet to develop 4 of their pieces, whereas Morphy's mobilised all his soldiers, and all he really needs to do now is castle and bring his other rook over, and he's going to have a lovely game. Unfortunately, this move, and again, if anyone in the chat wants to offer the move you'd play in this position, it's a pretty tricky move to find. Someone in the chat did the chess personality test. That's a funny result there. But yeah, it's a tricky move to find. So we've seen a principle in action: getting your pieces out, getting them developed. The next principle is sacrificing pieces. So people like to do piece sacrifices, but you really need to work it out properly. You really need to calculate, and Morphy does. He calculates here, and he realizes that actually this position is primed for a piece sacrifice. So that's what he goes for. He goes for knight takes on b5, and now you're swapping a minor piece for 2 pawns, which isn't a disaster anyway, even if it weren't for a great position, but it is for a great position. So he recaptures with the pawn. Interestingly, before I showed the line in the game, so that was the move that was played. Even here, the best move is to just play queen b4 check and just trade the queens off. Again, you don't really have any option. The queens have to come off. Bishop recaptures with check. You block, and then you take the knight. The bishop takes your pawn with check, and you go into this after the knight blocks. You finally pick up the bishop, and you go into this endgame. And now I believe you are 2 pawns down. Although one of them is doubled, so it's sort of similar to before. Maybe the Duke and the Count calculated this, and they thought, well, we don't want to go into this endgame against Morphy. But maybe not, because this was actually the best way to proceed. So instead of queen b4 check, recapturing with the pawn, and this allows Morphy to do what he wanted to do, which is take with the bishop, with check, and I don't know why that arrow is there. Knight comes into block. You can't. Oh yeah, that's why. Yeah, so you can't really move your king. The only you might be thinking, well, why do we want to self-pin ourselves by putting the knight in the way? Why don't we just move our king? You're basically going to get checkmated very quickly if you move your king into the center. You allow white to bring his rook into the game with tempo. All the pieces are just pointing towards the black king. You're not going to survive for very long at all if you move the king. So block is the best move. And now again, another lovely move by Morphy. As I mentioned before, he needs to get his final few pieces into the game. These 2 rooks. You could kingside castle, bring this rook over. You could just bring this rook over immediately, or you could do 2 in 1, and you could do a nice queenside castle. Gets the king safe, immediately adds another attacker to this knight, putting a lot of pressure down the d-file. Lovely stuff from Paul Morphy. So this knight is now attacked twice. You might think, well, it's defended 3 times, so we're all right. But the problem is that this knight's not really defending it. Okay, it's not technically pinned in the way that this knight is, because that knight literally can't move due to the rules of the game. This knight could move, but you'll lose your queen. So let's say black plays a really slow move. White could just capture the knight with check, even capture with the rook, and if you capture with the queen, you give up the queen. You can't capture with the king because either the rook or the bishop will defend the other one, and if you capture with the knight, again you give up your queen. So you need to react to this threat essentially. So rook d8 to add another defender to the knight, and now again another lovely move by Mr. Paul Morphy. If you look at this position again, if you want to offer a solution in the chat, I'll keep my eye on that and try it. But there are a few ways to proceed in this position, but there's one really good, really fun way to proceed. The hint is that this is your only piece that's not really doing anything in the game, and the fact that you don't really want to allow black time to unravel. So if you can see a way to get this rook into the game without really allowing black any free moves to just sort of untangle his pieces, then that's going to be a good move, and it does follow in our theme of sacrificing pieces. So someone has said Queen D3 in the chat. So that's a pretty good move. That's going to add more pressure to the knight here. If your idea of Queen D3 to put more pressure on the knight will probably be better placed with Queen A4, because then you add more pressure on the knight, but crucially you don't essentially allow black to x-ray your queen with his rook. And actually I'll show you the line if queen goes to A4. It's not a bad move. It's certainly fine. The best way to proceed as black is with Queen B4, and then you just get the mother of all trades. So everything just comes off the board, and you go into an endgame. So after the queen comes here, the rook takes the knight. The knight comes back. The bishop takes the rook. The queen swaps off. Obviously, you want to take the queen back. We pick up the bishop, and then the rook comes to D1 to pin the knight. After the king unpins, we take the knight, and you go into this endgame again where Morphy's 2 pawns up. So again, maybe maybe Morphy just didn't want to go for this winning endgame, and that's if the Duke and the Count play the most precise move, which is Queen B4. However, there is a better move which has now been suggested in the chat. Rook D7 rather. So Rook D7. Why is this a good move? It's a good move because it allows black very limited options. It's essentially a forcing move. You could capture back with your queen, but then you'll just lose your queen, so you don't really want to do that. Again, you could capture back with your knight, but again, you'll lose your queen, so you don't really want to do that. So you only really have one option to capture with the rook. Obviously, you can't capture with the king because the bishop defends, and you can't put yourself in check. So capture back with the rook, and now, well, everything proceeds as planned because we've found a way to get our final rook into the game. Rook comes over, and it's basically the position we had, rewinded 2 moves, except now we've swapped our rubbish rook in the corner for one of black's best defensive pieces. So again, now everything's just pinned. It's just a lovely position. Like the rook's pinned to the king, the knight's pinned to the queen. There's not really any way to proceed here for black. So in this futility, black tries Queen E6. So he's sort of hoping that Morphy might just go for a queen trade. It does unpin the queen from the knight. Now this rook's defended 3 times. The knight's not pinned anymore. Maybe you can make something happen. Unfortunately, this position is just completely crushing. So the move Morphy played was bishop takes on D7, and you don't really have many options. The problem is the move that was played in the game is knight takes on D7, and that might look like a natural move. And if you assess the pieces on the board, again, black's up a minor piece for 2 pawns. So if you can hold this, he might be all right. But we'll return to this position in a moment. The other options are to capture with the queen, but you can see why that is just clearly losing, because you give it your queen and you go into this endgame where white has a queen for a rook and a knight, and he's up 2 pawns, so easy win really for Morphy. And if you elect to move the king, so you just say, well, I'm not going to react to your threat, you might think, well, now we'll just win the queen. But, well, actually, there's an even better way to proceed. There's a forced checkmate in 4 moves. So queen comes to b4. Only move is the king to go back. Queen goes to the back rank. King moves over, and a nice little queen behind the king here. And the only piece attacking the queen is the knight, but unfortunately the knight is also pinned to the king now. And you might be thinking, well, the king can also go to d8. Well, if the king goes to d8, then it's just the same as the line we showed. Queen checkmates in 2 moves. So the move that was played in the game, knight takes. It looks like the most logical move. Why is it a bad move? Well, Morphy's already sacrificed his knight. He sacrificed a rook. We may as well keep climbing that sacrificial ladder and sacrifice the only piece that's more valuable, which is the queen. And the reason behind what I'll show you, which is a queen sacrifice, is if this knight wasn't on the board, we could get a nice checkmate here by putting the rook on this square, because the rook is defended by the bishop, and then the king won't be able to move anywhere. And obviously you can't block because the two pieces are next to each other. So how can we distract this knight away? You could just make a silly move like move your queen here and hope he takes with the knight, but that's, you know, hope chess, so we don't want to do that. So instead, queen b8 checks the king. King can't move anywhere because the bishop slices down here. You've got no pieces to block with, so your only option is to capture the queen. And now, you know, praise be, the square is clear, and we can go ahead with our plan. And indeed, Morphy does. So a checkmate in 17 moves by poor Morphy, and you know, somewhat amazingly, it all sort of stemmed from this knight f6 move. Led to a bit of a roller coaster or a bit of a spiral where yeah, the Duke and the Count didn't really make the most precise moves, but again, you know, it wasn't always clear how to proceed. But yeah, really lovely game from Morphy, and pretty nice like final picture there where you know, black's up a queen and a knight, and yet has still lost the game. Yeah, so I think we've come to the end of the analysis section.